But the unfortunate thing is that the majority of people in Europe do not have a voice, and many of them are censoring themselves.
Yes.
Especially in businesses and companies. I think the thing that we've learned, for good or bad, is that even in the most modern world, you still need to have the means and the resources within a nation state to deal with crisis situations. I mean, that was clear in the pandemic. People realized that you couldn't rely on an international organization. I think the Republicans made a big mistake. And the big mistake they made is they became a caricature, so almost like the mirror image of their opponents instead of rising above it all. And it was very unfortunate that they decided to make abortion into an issue.
Hello and welcome. My name is Paul Boniface. My guest on the podcast today is Professor Frank Furedi. He is an emeritus professor at the University of Kent and he is the author of 26 books. In this podcast we discuss a whole range of issues. Topics are the values driving the EU, the effect of the midterm elections on the culture wars, the COP27 conference in Egypt and the dehumanizing effects of the introduction of Ecocide in criminal law in Belgium, the current state of affairs in the war in Ukraine, and what happens when the Russian Federation falls apart. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to our channel and website. And now, on to the podcast.
It's a great privilege to meet you. You are an emeritus professor at the University of Kent, sociology. You are the most quoted sociologist in the UK. You are also a prolific writer, author of 26 books, if I'm not mistaken, and the last one was The Road to Ukraine. The reason for contacting you is that you are the executive director now of a Hungarian think tank in Brussels, which is called Mathias Corvinus Collegium. And my first question to you would be, what is the aim of this MCC Brussels?
Well, the reason why I was interested in taking this job on is because I always see Brussels as providing a very one-sided, extremely narrow conformist narrative about what it means to be European. Mm-hmm. And the values that it promotes and advocates are not necessarily that which a lot of people in Europe share. But nevertheless, as far as they're concerned, they can more or less determine what can and what cannot be said, particularly in public life. And one of the things that they've done is that for people like Hungarians or Poles or people who have a more traditional view of Europe and the world, they kind of create a quarantine around it, basically saying that these people are not worth talking to. Mm-hmm. There's no point in discussing and debating. We know what's right. These people are obviously wrong. And my job, as I see it, is to challenge this and to offer an alternative that suggests that actually there's an intellectually and politically interesting alternative which represents European values, European traditions much better than they do. And that, in a sense, if you are genuinely a European institution and you believe in Europe, then you must also believe in tolerance, you must also believe in open discussion and debate, and you must be open to the idea that you might be wrong and that people like me are right. Otherwise, if you don't have that, you end up in a very kind of conformist, almost dogmatic framework, which is how I see Brussels at the moment.
Yes. Well, the motto of the EU used to be unity in diversity, but there is not that much intellectual diversity anymore. But it's also quite pervasive. It's like hegemonic in society. You see the same views echoed by multinationals, by the social cultural sector, by the media. So what you're trying to do is you come with a different narrative. How difficult is that? Because you are going against this huge hegemony of ideas.
Well, it's not going to be easy, that's for sure. But I think that if you are able to develop arguments and ideas and provide good research and provide publications that illuminate human experience clearly, then I think you can begin to get people to understand that what we're saying is interesting, it's worth thinking about. That's the beginning, and maybe many will also agree with us. I think that there are many areas where the European Union oligarchy is rarely challenged.
Yes.
And therefore they've become very complacent. So one of the things that this organization will do in Brussels is raise issues that are almost ignored or almost like suppressed as not important. So even issues like culture and arts are very rarely seen from a different point of view. I want to organize conferences on things like what are museums for? Mm-hmm. Because museums, used to be about preserving art. Now they've been politicized.
Yes. And
to me, it's a very important part of our lives, but it's not debated. So I think that if we get people from the museum world to come along and discuss this thing, you can begin to get people to see that on important cultural matters there is no real debate and discussion. And the big issue for me will be the work we're doing on education.
Yes.
Because throughout Europe, the levels of education are being lowered and lowered and lowered.
You wrote a book on academia and free speech.
I did, yeah. And also on schools, not just universities. Yes. And I think the way they teach history, the kind of curriculum that the EU pushes, is really it's very Philistine. It's very narrow-minded.
It's also combined with gender identity ideology, so there's a whole narrative behind.
Exactly.
The whole ideology even. It's more than a narrative.
Yeah, I call it indoctrination rather than education.
Yes.
So we're going to have a big conference in October. We're getting teachers from all over Europe. Because although it's people like me are Hungarian, I'm not really Hungarian because I lived in Britain most of my life, but I'm really Hungarian.
You left 66 years ago.
A long time ago, yeah. I mean, emotionally I am, but sort of, given the fact that all my life was in the West, it's a bit different. But nevertheless, I want to bring in Spanish, French, sort of Flemish, all kinds of different kinds of people, because I think that if we work together as real Europeans, with our own diverse way of seeing things, we can create a kind of a point of reference, a focus for people who are there, but at the moment haven't got a home where they can stand up and feel that they can have an open, honest, but direct discussion.
Yes, diversity has been redefined lately to mean people of different color, different gender, but all thinking the same. It's not really encompassing intellectual diversity anymore.
Well, it's an interesting point you raise, because I've written a lot about this. Because one of the interesting things is, the European Union in the document says that diversity is their principal value. Now, that is a really stupid thing to say, because diversity is not a value. It's a description. Diversity means many, right?
Yes.
And the many is no more a value than the few, right? And in a sense, the fact that they've got away all this time with almost creating this kind of Ersatz value. And of course, what's interesting is that their idea of diversity, the many, only basically links to certain things.
Yes.
So they're not interested in the diversity of national cultures in Europe, because they want all national cultures to be like the other ones, and with the EU stamp on it. They're not interested in diverse viewpoints or philosophies. Yeah. They want just one. And so there's a kind of fundamental dishonesty there, and that's why I think our kind of work is quite important.
Yes.
Because if you challenge the philosophical or the intellectual underpinnings of what they're saying, it's going to be very, very thin on their part. There's not really very much. And
well, what you see a lot when you try to negotiate with this hegemony, that they refuse to debate. They start calling you names, they start insulting you, because they are very, very much aware that they don't have the intellectual basis to engage in a discussion. They sort of avoid it, or they insult the other part.
I think there is this big problem where they basically say that the very fact that you think differently than I do is already a problem. This is particularly the case in relation to identity politics, because, for example, if you're a transgender person, and I criticize your claim that there are more than 2 or 3 genders, there's dozens or hundreds of them, then they will say, what you're doing is not just criticizing the idea, you're attacking me, because that's what I am.
It's a hate crime in certain countries.
Yeah, so you can, it's not possible to have a discussion, because any criticism is seen as a criticism of an idea or of a person.
They do not, this viewpoint is not the viewpoint of a majority of Europeans in different countries. It's the elite view, the cultural, the media elite, the social elite, but it is not the view of the working class people. It's actually, somebody in the UK called it a new way of looking down upon the views of the working class.
It is that, and but the unfortunate thing is that the majority of people in Europe do not have a voice, and many of them are censoring themselves.
Yes.
Especially in businesses and companies. And what happens is that, although at the moment their view is the minority, because of their influential positions within cultural institutions, within companies, they're able to set the agenda.
Yes.
And not just that, but, and this is where the danger to me lies in the long run, because they also control the media and things like Netflix and others, they can and schools, they can influence.
Culture at large, Disney, you name it. All the big multinationals echo these views. Yeah?
And therefore they can target and influence young people.
Yes.
And that's where the battlefield is for the hearts of the young.
Behind the parents' back.
Especially behind the parents' back. Yeah.
So you're having a first big event now in on the 15th.
Yeah, on Tuesday.
Here in Brussels. What is that about?
Well, it's an introduction. We're beginning by looking at Europe's place in this new geopolitical situation after the pandemic and the war in the Ukraine. And we're looking at just 2 problems to begin with. One problem deals with, what are the values that Europe should be thinking about in the present condition, essentially in the context of a culture war that's being fought out. So one panel is looking at values to do with history and to do with essentially moral issues, and the second one is looking at the economic, geopolitical, because in many ways there's no real open discussion about how Europe's place has changed particularly since the war, and particularly since globalization has led to the much more fragmented global economy and greater competition, and where there's a lot of positioning where arguably America is squeezing Europe, as is China, and Europe, particularly the EU, is really incompetent at knowing how to situate itself in this new world.
Well, we've gone from a unipolar world where the US is hegemonic to we are evolving to a multipolar world, which will be completely different, with much more geopolitical rivalry.
We have to make a distinction between globalization as an ideology. Nation states are not important. They say, well, they basically argue that everything will be harmonious and
no borders.
No borders. That's not going to happen.
No.
And the economic side of it, which means that in terms of the way that trade and investment and all these flows are going to carry on, I think those things are going to continue, maybe on not the same level of intensity. But what we're having now is the creation of new economic blocks, where and much greater degree of focus on making sure that the nations are a little bit more self-sufficient on food, energy, things like that.
The US is really, really falling back on the NAFTA region and pulling back from the world, it seems.
Yeah, I think the thing that we've learned, for good or bad, is that even in the most modern world, you still need to have the means and the resources within a nation state to deal with crisis situations. I mean, that was clear in the pandemic. People realized that you couldn't rely on an international organization to get vaccines. The World Health Organization the European Union wasn't going to help you. You had to find those vaccines yourself.
Yeah.
And now with the war in Ukraine, people are finding that it's not going to be that easy to get your hand on, sort of gas or electricity or liquid gas. All these things everybody's going out looking for those sources, because they know that at the end of the day, their future, their lives is determined by the quality of the national government.
Exactly. And it's also the level of power which is much closer to them. A lot of people feel these supranational structures quite alien and not having the same kind of authority. You were talking about the culture war, and we just had the midterm elections in the US. We saw that the Trump candidates did not fare well. The US voter seems to be sick of the insanity, both of the woke and but also the other extreme. And they seem to reward Ron DeSantis, who is one of the, let's say, leaders in the fight against wokeism and gender identity ideology. How important is that, you think, for what we are trying to achieve in Europe?
Well, I think it's quite important. I think the Republicans made a big mistake. And the big mistake they made is they became a caricature, so almost like the mirror image of their opponents, instead of rising above it all. And it was very unfortunate that they decided to make abortion into an issue, because they stupidly don't realize that abortion is something that is an essential part in people's lives. And if you come out against it, what you're saying is you don't trust women. That's the big mistake, and a lot of young people and women decided to vote for Democrats, not because they like the Democrats, just because they saw this as being a really significant attack on their autonomy.
Yes.
Sort of on their personal autonomy, on their freedom of choice. And it seems to me that our side has got to believe in freedom of choice. Yeah. Otherwise, we don't have any moral authority. So I think, this is a big problem for me, that so many of the people on my side do not understand the importance of tolerance, and the importance of moral autonomy, moral independence. These are fundamental questions that historically have evolved, and if you just simply ignore them, you become, in many respects, just simply the mirror image of those people you're hostile to. And you don't rise above that, and you don't really see the big picture.
Hungary is a bit of the bête noire in the EU constellation, and but the EU seems to have a big stick to make to push Hungary in the direction it wants, with this 22.5 billion that they are withholding, that Hungary is now negotiating.
Yeah. Hungary is the bad boy of Europe as far as the EU is concerned. And they don't like the government for a simple reason, that it's the only government that has confidently put forward a very clear alternative way of looking at the world, and it's kind of thinking more long term rather than short term.
Everywhere you look, there's a profound division within society. Does this exist in Hungary or not, or to a lesser extent?
It exists in Hungary, and it resembles, in many respects, what happens in Britain, where I live most of the time, or in Italy, where you have, first of all, a division between the capital city and the rest of society. Yeah. Paris, sort of the countryside, the provinces, London, the north. Yeah. You have that everywhere, and also that's overlaid by class. So I spend a lot of time in Italy. And there, the payday, the party of the left, is really the professional lawyers, doctors. I call them the laptop class.
Well, it's like the ecologists here in Belgium.
Exactly, the ecologists. So they're not working class. They're not left like in the old days.
No.
Who argue for
they are the bourgeois left.
Yeah. And then the people that vote for Meloni or some of the other parties are, working class people. So the village where I live in Italy, it's so clear, the only person that voted for payday was, one accountant and, one of the big real estate owners, but the rest of them were just against it. So you have that. Now Hungary has got that. So Budapest is a little bit different than the rest of Hungary.
I liked the description that Paul Mberi gave, the somewheres and the anywheres, to talk about this division in society.
Yeah, you have that very much. But in Hungary, it's a little bit. What has happened in Hungary is that the government there has established, sort of a real base for itself amongst the people.
Well, they won the election with 2/3 for the fourth time. So
I mean, it was amazing.
He should be viewed as one of the most successful democratic politicians. And Fidesz is an extremely successful party. But why is it then that they are described by the international media as, the bad boy, as an autocracy?
Well, the thing is that there is this kind of double standard, whereby if you have a government that you don't like because their value system is entirely opposite to yours. I mean, it is, the government's view of the world in terms of tradition, about community, about religion, about family, just about everything, sovereignty being very important, as opposed to federalism, is the very opposite of what the EU is all about. And that's seen as a danger by the bubble here in Brussels, and that's why they kind of constructed this story that somehow Hungary is an autocracy. And to me it's very interesting, because I always remember, when you had those demonstrators in Paris, the Gilets jaunes, and the police just come and they kill a couple of people. They really beat people up, and it's it's like that's what a police state does. Hungary's got demonstrations just like that, but the police just stand back. And I just thought, there is just no police violence, and yet Hungary is the authoritarian one, and the other one, France, is just a very democratic, peaceful country.
Double standard. We just had the COP27 conference in Egypt. I was wondering about your thoughts on that, because I think we're all concerned about the environment, and I think most people agree that something should be done. But apparently there's only one narrative that you're allowed to have or to echo. And to me it seems a bit like the whole agenda has been hijacked by the radical left.
I think that these international conferences are essentially performative. They're kind of a public performance, where you have politicians trying to look impressive and statesmanlike. People who at home in their own countries are just nobodies. Suddenly they're on the world stage. We are here, and so there's it's like a performance, a theater performance. Sometimes I think it's more like a circus, but it's kind of halfway between the two. And the decisions that are made there have pretty much a propagandistic value to them. I don't think that that necessarily means that whatever they decide is going to make the slightest bit of difference in terms of policy.
It's giving a lot of momentum to certain radical factions in different countries. In our country now, ecocide has been written into law.
Yeah, is that right?
So nature has a legal, let's say, personality.
I didn't know that.
But it's a proposal by one of our ministers to have ecocide as part of the criminal law.
Interesting, because I debated the woman who invented the concept of ecocide in Norway. There was a meeting there, and I felt that there was only a matter of time before this idiocy will become, realized.
Why is it idiotic, Professor? Because I think a lot of people don't know what it's all about. Could you maybe explain it in simple terms? What is ecocide, and why is it a good or a bad idea?
Well, laws are interesting, because laws are not just simply about telling you what to do and what you cannot do. There's what we call in English an expressive dimension to it. So the laws send a message.
Yes.
That's the most important thing in relation to ecocide. It sends out a message, that when you basically, pull up a plant, then the violence you do to that plant is very similar if I hit a child. There's an attempt to basically dehumanize our existence, so the boundary between a human being and nature becomes entirely eroded, and that has got important propagandistic value, because aside from the environmental issues, it lowers our moral standing as human individuals But it's also obviously the potential of that means that if you begin to pass laws which criminalizes human behavior, then it basically creates a much more totalitarian political settings where behavior comes under tremendous amount of control, and it reaches tremendous depths now.
Yeah.
Just to give you an example of how bad things are, my wife wants to do a PhD, and her dissertation topic is to look at the difference in human beings and animals. She wants to be able to show, she wants to understand, sort of in what way we're different, sort of, and our moral concepts, how, in what way is that different than how animals behave. And she cannot find a single supervisor in philosophy in Britain, because most philosophers are either too scared to go down that road, or alternatively they believe that there is no distinction between humans and animals, and that my wife is what they call a speciesist for arguing that. So when you get to this,
God is really dead.
God is really dead, and this kind of powerful sense of stability has gained intellectual standing amongst philosophers.
Not only that, but the infantilization. Zubi sent out a tweet yesterday saying that, let me get it here quickly, there is a big push in society to treat adults like children and treat children like adults. Where does this come from all of a sudden? Because it didn't used to be that way when I was younger.
Well, the shift begins to kick in the 1970s when adult authority is fundamentally undermined, where the role of adults as taking responsibility for the young is seen as being almost dictatorial. You begin to talk about children's rights, the democratization of the family. You have the situation where the teachers in schools, instead of teaching children and being the authority figures, decide that the best way to teach is to become children's friends, and they start making jokes, wearing T-shirts, so I'm really cool, so the whole idea of a teacher as somebody who's kind of educating children into discipline and cultivating their intellectual independence, that goes. So I think it comes from, it really kicks in with the, essentially the powerful influence, first in the United States and everywhere else, of psychology. Where psychology displaces theology, and psychology displaces history and ideology, and essentially what happens is that people are beginning to see more like patients rather than as citizens.
Medicalization of everything.
Exactly, and when you begin to have that, then children begin to be treated as if they're vulnerable and weak. You have to protect them all the time. You have to insulate them from bad experiences. And as a result of that, it takes much longer to grow up.
Yes.
You have delayed adolescence, and basically you have
40-year-old
40-year-old boys, 40-year-old boys and 40-year-old girls who, instead of regarding themselves as men and women, they are behaving like children. And before you infantilize the young, you infantilize yourself. And that's, if you go to America, sometimes you meet these people and they are behaving in a way that historically children used to behave.
Yeah.
So there's an interesting expression I use. One is infantilizing sort of children, but also adultifying them, because as the boundary between adults and children goes, you basically sometimes sort of treat them in a very childish way, as if they're really childish, but also as adults who you can talk to about sex and pornography, and there's nothing. They are they're potential adults already. So they got this mixed message that's being sent to them.
So there's really no boundary anymore.
No boundary. That's the key thing.
No. Professor, you wrote a book about the road to Ukraine. Hungary shares a border with Ukraine. And I really wanted to get your view on the state of the war now. It seems that Ukraine is doing extremely well in fending off the Russian attack. They seem to have today retaken Kherson, which is extremely important. I think a lot of people might think, okay, this is going to be over real quick. What do you think? And secondly, there's this perception in I think a lot of society that Putin is the bad boy and it's all his fault, and once he's gone, it's all going to be solved.
Well, I think that this is I call it, in the book, I talk about it as a typical frontier war. That's not going to end anytime soon. I think this is going to be a very, very long war, one that neither side can really afford to lose, and neither side can win in the end. So it's one of those things, and for a number of geopolitical reasons, what I really worry about is that even if there's a peace treaty, it will be like a temporary one. And in many respects, the situation in Ukraine and Russia reminds me of the era before First World War, when things are shifting and changing. So that just because Russia is so weak, it doesn't really mean that it's no longer able to protect its borders, and that's going to go away. It's lost the war so far because its soldiers are not motivated. They not committed. Ukrainians are fighting for their homes. They're fighting for their lives. So
it's imperialism versus nationalism, really.
Yeah, it's a kind of it is a bit like that. Although there are a lot of Russian nationalists, they've kind of are in a minority within the Russian context. I think the problem is not Putin, sort of simply. It's to do with the way that the end of the Cold War created what I call the Russia question, which means that Russia, like Germany beforehand, is both a very powerful nation that wanted respect and wanted to have a status in the world, but it wasn't really strong enough to be able to realize that in the case of Russia, it's facing a lot of internal tensions.
Yes, what happens when imagine that Putin is no longer there? His replacement will probably not be, might be more charming, but in order to hold that empire together, will have to be equally, let's say, authoritarian.
Yeah, I don't. In the long run, I don't see Russia being able to hold on to a lot of large parts of its existing borders. You have to remember that already there are all these little conflicts in Kazakhstan, Armenia and Azerbaijan are heading for.
There's not a lot of talk about Armenia, Azerbaijan.
No.
I remember in another interview you mentioned that this might turn out to be even more important than the Ukraine war, Azerbaijan and Armenia. What do you mean by that? I've been wanting to ask you ever since.
Well, I mean, they are really quite significant countries with tremendous power, and what happens in Armenia, Azerbaijan is paralleled by what's happening in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, who are also having a conflict. Kazakhstan, who's breaking away from the whole, its links to Russia. And while all this is going on, the Chinese and the Turkish people, Turkish governments are going in there, so they're creating a very fluid situation.
Yes.
Where there's a strange mix of Islamic influence powers, Chinese economic might, sort of gradually undermining Russia's hegemony in that area.
So once Russia starts to fall apart, there's a whole lot of other problems that are along the corner that we don't quite see right now.
We don't see it, but
with Turkey, with Iran maybe also.
Yeah, exactly, and that's more dangerous because in the case of Ukraine and Russia, it's bad, it's very bad, but it's clear that there is this localized at the moment. Russia is not going to invade the Balkans or Poland, so it's very, very local. Whereas the rest of it is much more sort of fragmentary and completely novel. We have no idea of how that part of the world, which people have ignored in the West, it's a big part of the world, how that's going to play itself out.
Yeah, and who will be the ally with who, etc., etc.
Yeah.
Professor, I think you have a game that you want to see, but you have written so much about fear, and you are introducing with MCC this fear barometer. Could you maybe tell us what that is about to conclude?
Well, I'm going to organize a research on the question of what European people fear, because my experience is that from my own studies, my own research, that different nations fear different things, and that's interesting. So East Europeans are much more worried about Russia. West Europeans are more worried about nuclear war that Russia will start on us. So you got those things, but very often what people fear is not the same as what the media think it fears, and because they have different problems, different kinds of pressures. So we're going to do research on that, and then we're going to do a yearly fear barometer, where we look at how, from year to year, people's concerns, anxieties has changed.
Yeah.
And in what are the countries where people are most worried and insecure, and why?
Yeah.
We thought it'd be really quite an interesting thing to look at.
Excellent. Okay,
Yeah.
I look forward to see how that goes.
All right.
I'm going to let you go to the game. I thank you very much, very grateful for this talk.
All
and
right.
I wish you the best of luck with the MCC going forward.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, sir.
All the best.
Thank you.